I am going to tell you something I have never said out loud on camera, and my old shop foreman would probably kick me in the shins for sharing it. For about 3 years in my 20s, I worked at a chain repair franchise where the service manager kept a little laminated card taped to the inside of his desk drawer. That card listed the upsells he wanted us to add to every ticket that crossed $40 in labor. Brake fluid flush, power steering flush, throttle body service, fuel induction cleaning. The card had check boxes. You were measured on how many boxes you could get the customer to nod at while the car sat on the lift with the wheels off. Honestly, most of the men I worked with were decent people who hated that card. A few of them loved it. The ones who loved it are the reason I am writing this script. Because the tricks they used were not loud, they were quiet, polished, and almost always wrapped in something that sounded like concern for your safety. Today, I want to walk you through 7 of those quiet tricks, the ones I watched get pulled on real customers in real bays. So the next time a service advisor leans across the counter with a clipboard and a worried face, you can read the room a little better than you could yesterday. Before I get into the 7 tricks themselves, one thing to set straight. The honest mechanics in this country still outnumber the dishonest ones by a wide margin, in my experience. The problem is that the dishonest minority operates on a playbook refined for decades, and the playbook is invisible to the customer because the customer has no reference point for comparison. The 7 tricks I am going to describe are not theories I read about online. They are moves I personally watched executed in a real shop, by real coworkers, on real customers. The patterns are remembered, not invented. The first trick is the one I call the flashlight inspection, and it is probably the most common move in the entire industry. Here is how it works. You bring the car in for an oil change. The technician finishes the oil in about 12 minutes. Then he grabs a flashlight, walks around the car, and starts pointing at things. He points at a slightly damp area on the engine. He points at a rubber boot with a tiny crack in the surface. He points at a coolant hose that looks a little glossy. Then he calls the service advisor over, and the two of them stand there nodding at each other while you watch through the waiting room glass. The advisor comes back inside with a printed list: valve cover gasket seeping, axle boot beginning to fail, upper radiator hose showing signs of degradation. Total recommended work, somewhere north of $1,500. Look, some of those items might genuinely need attention eventually. But the trick is the staging. A damp valve cover at 120,000 miles is not a 5-alarm fire. A surface crack on a rubber boot does not mean the boot is torn through. The flashlight inspection turns normal aging into urgent failure by using vocabulary that sounds clinical: seeping, compromised, degraded. Those words may be technically accurate, but the urgency is manufactured. A trustworthy shop will tell you in plain language whether something needs to be fixed this week, this season, or this decade. If every item on your inspection sheet is colored red or yellow, and nothing is colored green, you are probably standing in front of someone who learned this script from a binder. Let me put a face on the flashlight inspection, because the abstraction does not land until you picture the person it happens to. A school counselor named Erica Shaver, mid-40s, brought her crossover into a chain franchise on the north side of Cincinnati for a routine oil change one Saturday morning. She had budgeted $45 for the visit. She walked out with an inspection sheet that totaled $2,100 in supposedly urgent work, with 7 items highlighted in bright yellow, and 3 more circled in red marker the advisor had drawn himself for emphasis. The receipt itself is worth studying for a moment, because the language on it is the whole game. Each line item used a verb cluster designed to spike alarm. Power steering reservoir showing contamination. Front strut mount exhibiting compression. Rear differential housing displaying surface oxidation. Translate those phrases into plain English and you get fluid that has aged, a rubber mount that has settled the way every rubber mount settles, and a metal case that has the same light rust every aluminum andiron part picks up after a few winters. Nothing on that receipt described a failure. Everything On it described aging dressed up in lab coat vocabulary. The smell in the waiting room that morning was burnt coffee and lemon floor cleaner, the kind of mix that puts your nervous system on a slight edge before the advisor even opens his mouth. Erica kept the receipt, walked it to an independent shop her brother-in-law recommended, and the second mechanic looked at it for about 90 seconds before he handed it back and told her none of it needed doing for at least another year. She drove that car for 2 more years without failures. The honest counter simple matters too, because not every inspection sheet is a trap. Some shops catch real problems on a routine visit. The difference is proportion. 1 or 2 recommendations is normal. 8 or 9 urgent items is almost certainly someone reading from a binder. The second trick is the phantom noise. This one takes a little more skill, which is why the better technicians can pull it off without anyone catching on. You bring the car in for a brake job, the work gets done. You pay, you drive home, and a few days later, you notice a slight rattle that was not there before. You bring the car back. The advisor listens to you describe the noise, nods sympathetically, and says they will have a technician take a look. The technician comes back 10 minutes later and reports that your sway bar and links are worn, which is causing the rattle you are hearing. He says it is a safety concern. He quotes you for $100. Now, here is what may have actually happened. The brake job was done correctly, but during the reassembly, a heat shield got bent slightly, or a caliper bracket bolt got a torque value that was a touch shy, or a wheel weight got knocked loose. Any of those would produce a small rattle. None of them require new sway bar and the links. But the technician has been trained to associate every rattle with a part he can sell. So the part gets quoted, the part gets installed, and the original cause of the rattle gets quietly corrected during the reinstall, because removing the sway bar to swap the end links requires moving a lot of nearby hardware anyway. The noise goes away, you assume the diagnosis was correct. The shop pockets for $100 for a problem they may have created. I am not saying this happens at every shop. I am saying it happens often enough that I watched it happen with my own eyes more than a few times, and I never figured out a clean way to confront the men who did it without losing my job, so I quit. The mechanical decode matters here, because the rattle is the kind of thing your ear catches at 35 miles per hour over a rough stretch, the way a loose marble in a coffee tin announces itself. A heat shield is a thin metal panel bolted near the catalytic converter. When a technician swings a brake caliper out of the way, his impact wrench can catch the shield and tweak a bolt a quarter turn loose. That quarter turn lets the shield vibrate at certain engine speeds. The honest fix is a 90-second reach under the car with a 10mm wrench. The dishonest fix is a $400 and link replacement that also happens to retighten the heat shield as a byproduct. A software engineer named Vihan Mahajan, in a suburb north of Austin, brought his sedan in for fronts and rears at a chain. 3 days later, the rattle started. The advisor pushed a Monday follow-up. Vihan declined and took the car to a second shop, where the mechanic found the loose bolt into minutes and charged nothing for $100 saved. A small detail about the phantom noise trick. If the advisor seems unusually eager to slot you in for a same-day follow-up after a major repair, that hospitality can be genuine, but it can also be the front end of a return visit upsell pipeline. A fresh repair primes a customer's trust, and some shops draw on that trust aggressively. The defense is to wait a few days before agreeing to a follow-up appointment for any new symptom, and to take it to a different shop for a second look first. The second shop has no incentive to protect the original work. The third trick is the bundled estimate, and this one is sneaky because it uses your own thrift against you. The advisor hands you a printout with 3 columns. Column 1 is the item you came in for. Column 2 is a list of additional services. Column 3 is a total that includes a discount if you do everything at once. The discount is real, the math checks out. Save $240 if you bundle. The catch is that most of the items in column 2 are not actually needed right now. They are services the shop wants to perform because the margin on each one is high and the labor time is short. A coolant flush takes 30 minutes and bills out at over $100. A transmission service on a sealed unit may be discouraged by your own manufacturer. A fuel system cleaning that involves pouring a bottle of solvent into your gas tank is something you can do yourself for $15 at any parts store. By bundling these items with one legitimate repair, the shop makes the whole package feel like a deal. Your brain sees the savings number and skips past the question of whether you needed any of it in the first place. The defense is simple. Ask the advisor to separate the bundle into individual items with individual prices and tell you which ones the manufacturer recommends at your current mileage. Watch the advisor's face when you ask that. The honest ones will sit down with the owner's manual and walk you through it. The other ones will get suddenly busy. The fourth trick is the one I want you to remember most clearly because it is the one that costs the most money and produces the least visible work. It is called the diagnostic loop. Here is the setup. You bring the car in because a warning light is on. The advisor charges you a diagnostic fee, usually somewhere between $100 and $150, to plug a scanner into the car and read the codes. The scanner spits out a code. The technician looks at the code and decides that the most likely cause is a specific sensor. The sensor gets replaced. You pay for the sensor and the labor, you drive away. 3 weeks later, the light comes back on, you return. The advisor charges you another diagnostic fee. The scanner reads the same code. The technician now decides that the next most likely cause is a different sensor. That sensor gets replaced, you pay again. 3 weeks later, the light comes back on. This loop can run for 5 rounds before the actual cause, which might be a chafed wire or a corroded ground point, finally gets identified. By that time, you have spent $1,200 in parts and diagnostic fees, and the fix turns out to be a $6 splice repair. Now hold that loop in your head for a second because I want to come back to it before the end. There is one specific thing you can ask a shop at the beginning of a diagnostic appointment that often shuts this loop down before it ever starts, and I will tell you what it is in just a moment. First, 3 more tricks you need to recognize. A short snapshot on the bundled estimate because numbers help. I once watched an advisor present a bundle to a young father with a 2-year-old SUV that had come in for a tire rotation. The bundle stacked a tire rotation, a coolant flush, a power steering flush, a brake fluid flush, a fuel system service, and a cabin air filter into a single offer that supposedly saved him $300 off the individual prices. The total was just under $900. He almost said yes. What he did not know was that his manufacturer maintenance schedule called for none of those flush services for at least another 40,000 miles, that the cabin air filter cost $6 at any parts store and took 2 minutes to swap himself, and that the tire rotation he had actually come in for was $18 on its own. He had walked in for an $18 service and was about to walk out $900 later. The owner manual, sitting in his glove box the whole time, would have answered every question the bundle raised. He left without authorizing the extras after I caught his eye and gave him a small headshake, which is the only time in 3 years I ever directly interfered with another advisor pitch, and I still think about whether I should have done it more often. The 5th trick is the parts upgrade switcheroo. The advisor calls you after the car is on the lift to tell you the original part you authorized has been discontinued, or is on backorder, or has been superseded by a newer version. The newer version costs $80 more. You are already at the shop, the car is already apart, and you do not want to wait another 3 days for the original part to arrive, so you say yes. What you may not realize is that the original part is often still available from the same supplier the shop uses, and the supersession is real but optional. The shop chose the more expensive part because the markup is higher. I once watched a service advisor put a customer on hold, walk to the parts counter, ask the parts manager for any reason at all to upcharge the brake rotor on a minivan in Bay 3, and then walk back to the phone and read the reason off a sticky note. The customer never knew to protect yourself. Ask the advisor to text you a picture of the part number on the box, then look that number up before you authorize the change. Takes 90 seconds, saves a small fortune over a few years. There is a subvariant of the parts switcheroo that uses brand names against you. The advisor tells you the original part you authorized was a generic aftermarket unit, and for an extra $50 they can upgrade to the factory equivalent brand with a longer warranty. Sometimes true, but in many cases the factory equivalent part is produced by the same plant, on the same line, as the generic. The only real difference is the box. Ask the advisor to write down both part numbers and spend 2 minutes searching the manufacturing origin before you agree to the upcharge. The sixth trick is the comeback warranty trap. This one is brutal. Because it punishes you for trusting the shop in the first place, you get a major repair done. Let us say a water pump and timing belt service on a 4-cylinder, which runs about $1,000. The shop gives you a 12-month parts and labor warranty. 6 months later, the engine develops a coolant leak. You bring it back, assuming the warranty will cover whatever is wrong. The advisor inspects the car and tells you the leak is not from the water pump, it is from the thermostat housing, which was not part of the original job. The thermostat housing repair will cost $400. You pay it because what choice do you have? What may have actually happened is that the technician who did the timing belt service noticed the thermostat housing was weeping a little but did not mention it because warning you would have meant either eating the additional labor or losing the upsell opportunity for later. By waiting 6 months, the shop gets to bill the labor twice. Once for the timing belt job, where the housing was already exposed. Once for the thermostat housing, where the housing has to be exposed all over again. The customer never sees the duplicate labor charge because each invoice looks reasonable on its own. The trick is in the sequencing. Consider what the receipt for the second visit shows when you lay it next to the first one on a kitchen table. Visit 1 lists timing belt, water pump, tensioner, accessory, drive belt, and for 0.2 hours of labor. Visit 2 lists thermostat, thermostat housing, gasket set, coolant refill, and 3.8 hours at the same rate. The duplication is loud. The accessory drive belt has to come off for either job. The upper timing cover has to come off for either job. You paid that same labor envelope twice. A nurse named Beatrice Okonjo, 51, who works night shifts at a hospital in suburban Atlanta, got hit with exactly this sequence on her 10-year-old minivan. The total came to $1,412. She felt uneasy about the second bill, but could not articulate why, because each line item read as plausible on its own. The smell in her van after the second job was the sweet, slightly burnt scent of fresh coolant spilled on a hot manifold during the refill, the scent that announces a job done in a hurry. A careful independent shop will pressure test the cooling system, the timing belt stage, and call you with the option to reseal weeping joints while the housing is already exposed. That call may cost an extra $90 in parts and 0 added labor. The dishonest sequencing costs you $400. The seventh trick, and this is the climax of the list because it is the one that scales up the fastest, is the safety bait estimate. This is the move where the advisor uses fear of a worst-case outcome to push a repair you do not need yet. The vocabulary is specific. Your tie rod could fail at highway speed. Your brake lines could rupture under hard braking. Your control arm bushing is one pothole away from giving out. The implication is that if you decline the work, you are gambling with your family lives. Some of those warnings, in some specific cases, are absolutely real. A tie rod with visible play does need to be replaced soon. A brake line with bubbling rust on the surface should be inspected closely, but the safety bait estimate uses the same alarming language for parts that have years of service left in them. It exploits the fact that you cannot see what the technician sees, and you do not want to be the person who said no to a safety repair and then read about a crash in the local paper. The biggest version of this trick involves a multi-point inspection sheet with 7 or 8 items all flagged as safety concerns. totaling for over $5,000 in recommended work. If you ever see an estimate like that, walk it across the street to a second shop for an independent inspection before you authorize a single bolt. The second opinion almost never matches the first one, and the difference between the two estimates will usually pay for the inspection 10 times over. Now back to that diagnostic loop I asked you to hold in your head. The specific thing you can ask a shop at the very beginning of a diagnostic appointment is this. Tell the advisor that you are willing to pay the diagnostic fee, but only if the shop agrees in writing that the fee covers the actual identification of the root cause, not just a code read. Phrase it exactly that way, root cause, not code red. A code read tells the technician what symptom the computer is seeing. A root cause analysis tells the technician what physical condition is producing that symptom. The difference between those two things may be 3 or 4 extra hours of testing with a meter, a smoke machine, and a wiring diagram. Most shops will not agree to that flat fee structure because it shifts the risk of a difficult diagnosis from your wallet to theirs. But the shops that do agree are usually the ones worth bringing your car to in the first place. The advisor reaction to that question alone will tell you most of what you need to know about the place. One more thing about the diagnostic loop, it persists because of how technicians are paid. Flat rate pay gives the technician a set number of hours for a job regardless of how long it actually takes. A sensor swap might pay an hour of labor. A real root cause investigation might take 4 or 5 hours of careful work and produce no billable parts. The system rewards replacement over investigation. Some shops absorb that misalignment because they value long-term retention. Most will not. Knowing the difference is worth more than any technical knowledge about your specific car. One more layer to the safety bait estimate. The version that hurts most involves elderly customers who have a reverent respect for the authority of anyone in a uniform. An older woman who comes in for a turn signal bulb leaves with a $4,000 estimate full of safety language has not been treated like a customer. She has been treated like a target. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent who drives, offer to be the person they call before they authorize any repair over a few $100s. A single phone call to a trusted family member can collapse the pitch in under a minute. The change in the advisor posture, from leaning forward to sitting back, tells you everything. A quick contrast for you before we close. A few years ago, I had to different cars into different shops in the same month. Same kind of complaint, a rough idle at startup. First shop, locally owned, run by a man named Russell who is somewhere north of 60 and somewhere south of Cheerful. Russell took the car for an hour, came back and told me the throttle body had carbon buildup, that he had cleaned it on the bench, that the idle was smoother, and that the bill was $80. Second shop, chain franchise, run by a service advisor whose name I have forgotten because he never made eye contact with me. The chain shop kept the car for 2 days, charged me a diagnostic fee, replaced an idle air control valve I did not need, and handed me a bill for $490. Same complaint, same era of vehicle, 6 times the cost. The difference was not the technology. The difference was the laminated card in someone's desk drawer. A short story to close. There was a woman named Brenda who came into the shop where I worked, driving a sedan with about 90,000 miles on it. She was a hospice nurse, worked long shifts, kept her car spotless inside, and asked one question when she dropped it off. She asked the advisor to be honest with her about what she actually needed because money was tight that month. The advisor took her information, smiled, walked back to the bay, and told the technician to find at least $800 worth of work on her car or he would be looking for a new job by Friday. The technician was a young guy, maybe 22, still figuring out who he wanted to be. He stood there with the work order in his hand for a long minute. Then he walked back to the front counter and told the advisor that the car needed an oil change and a new cabin air filter. Total bill $110, and that was all he was willing to put his name on. The advisor was furious. Brenda paid her bill, thanked them both, and drove away. The technician got written up that afternoon. He quit 2 weeks later. I lost touch with him, but I think about him almost every time someone asks me about car repair, because the difference between a shop that runs up your bill and a shop that does not is almost never about the equipment or the location or the brand on the sign. It is about whether the person standing at the counter is willing to lose his job to tell you the truth. Brenda's story does not end at the parking lot exit. 2 years later, she came back to the shop looking for me. The young technician had opened his own one big garage on the other side of town, working out of a rented unit behind a hardware store. She drove her car there that afternoon and became one of his first regular customers. The last I heard, he was running a 5-bay shop with 3 employees. Customers have more power than they think to reward honest behavior with their loyalty, and when they exercise that power deliberately, the market does respond. Slowly, imperfectly, but it does respond. The cars we drive will keep getting more complicated, the diagnostic tools will keep getting more expensive, and the pressure on repair shops to hit revenue targets will not get any softer. But the 7 tricks I just walked you through have been around for 40 years, and they will probably be around for another 40. The defense is not technical knowledge. The defense is paying attention to the language the advisor uses, the staging of the estimate, the willingness to itemize, and the response when you ask for a second opinion. If you have a story about one of these tricks happening to you, drop it in the comments below, because the more we name these moves out loud, the harder they get to pull. Somewhere out there, in a quiet bay at the end of a long row of lifts, a young technician is standing with a work order in his hand, trying to decide who he wants to be. The more of us who learn to read the signals, the easier we make that decision for him.